the global conversation around, sex and identity, it has never felt more intense.
Or more divisive.
Exactly. It's become so central to political life. You see it everywhere, right? The legislative battles in the UK over the Gender Recognition Act, for instance.
Or just the incredibly polarized debates you see on social media every single day.
And this conflict, often called gender critical, is shaping our culture in real time. And the sources show it has some really deep, often painful consequences for people.
And that intensity is exactly why we felt we needed to do this deep dive.
Right.
Our mission today is to really synthesize the core beliefs, the history, and the documented social conflicts around this movement.
The one often called gender critical feminism, or GCF.
Yes. And we're pulling from a whole stack of complex sources, everything from activist discussions and internal clinician notes to scholarly papers and international reports. We just want to map out the ideology and its impact as clearly as we can.
And I think we have to admit the complexity from the start. This is an ideology that, it traces its roots back to radical feminism.
A movement founded to challenge oppression.
Right. But the material shows it's evolved. It's now aligning itself with some broader and sometimes deeply conservative political movements.
It's a complicated picture.
So to really understand the current battleground, we have to start at the absolute foundation. What is a gender-critical movement fundamentally arguing?
Okay, so at its most basic level, our sources define GCF as an ideology that is set up to oppose what it calls gender ideology.
So it's a counter-movement.
Precisely. Its foundational belief is that sex is a biological, immutable binary. Male or female, that's it.
And gender identity.
Yeah.
Self-identification.
They see those not just as irrelevant, but as fundamentally oppressive ideas. They're seen as constructs that are just tied to, old-fashioned limiting gender roles.
So if sex is the absolute unchanging factor, what does that mean for their position on trans identities?
Well, it leads to a complete rejection of trans and non-binary identities.
A total rejection.
Yes. From their perspective, trans women are men and trans men are women. It's that simple. And that's why that phrase, adult human female, has become such a huge slogan for the movement.
It's a definitional statement.
It is. It's used as this very strict biological definition of what a woman is, and it's deliberately positioned against the idea of a self-identified gender.
Okay, so let's unpack the intellectual blueprint here. We look at a really fascinating source, a detailed analysis of GCF discussions, and it broke down 4 foundational beliefs they use.
The pillars of the argument, really.
Yeah, the pillars that justify their political butts.
They really are. And when you see them together, they form a pretty clear rationale for the hostility toward trans rights and self-ID.
So what's the first one?
The first belief is that there are absolutely no innate psychological differences between men and women.
Zero.
Zero. Any behavioral differences you see are, in their view, driven purely by social conditioning. And the analysis we read points out that this immediately creates a theoretical problem.
A problem for the existence of trans people.
Exactly, because the very idea of being in the wrong body usually relies on some sense of an internal psychological difference from your biological sex.
Okay, so that's the starting point. Where do they go from there?
Second, they assert that people assigned male at birth, or AM, are inherently more dangerous to those assigned female at birth.
More dangerous how?
Physically stronger and also socially conditioned toward aggression. And this premise is then used to justify the need for strict sex segregation.
In places like bathrooms, shelters?
All of it. Then third is the belief that AFA people suffer systemic discrimination and oppression specifically at the hands of AMA people.
A constant in society.
A constant. And that leads to the fourth and final belief, that the only way to counter this oppression is to create specific legal privileges, what they call sex-based rights, for AFA people.
And this is the core of their opposition to gender self-ID laws.
It is. They see self-ID as basically letting individuals escape discrimination by switching teams, which they feel undermines the protections that should be reserved only for the biologically oppressed group.
But this is where it gets really interesting, because the source analysis doesn't just list these beliefs, it points out a huge recognized contradiction right at the heart of the ideology.
Yes, it absolutely does. It raises a major question about how consistent this framework actually is.
I mean, how can you hold both of those beliefs at the same time?
Exactly. How can you maintain belief, one, that there are no innate psychological differences and everything is societal,
Right.
while also holding belief, two, which argues A and B people are unconditionally more dangerous because of some inherent tendency. If everything is societal, then that danger should be changeable, not tied to the immutable category of biology.
It seems like the political goal opposing trans identity is dictating the premises, rather than the other way around.
That's the critique.
So that clarifies the intellectual side. But the sources are clear this didn't just appear out of nowhere. It has some deep historical roots.
That's right. To really get this specific strain of thought, you have to go back.
Back to second-wave feminism.
Yes, and the really intense ideological fights that were often called the feminist sex wars in the 70s and 80s.
So this exclusion isn't some new reaction. It's an ideological inheritance.
It absolutely is. You have key historical figures who established this exclusionary idea very early on. Janice Raymond's 1979 book, The Transsexual Empire, is cited all the time as being hugely influential.
And what did she argue?
I mean, it was stark. She argued that transsexualism should be morally mandated out of existence.
Wow.
And she stated, very strikingly, that all transsexuals rape women's bodies by reducing the real female form to an artifact, appropriating this body for themselves.
So she's framing the act of transition itself as a form of patriarchal violence.
Yes, as an attempt to erase or mimic real women. That's the foundational claim.
Okay, so let's bring this into the present day. The sources detail a very contentious and I think really sensitive claim.
The idea that homophobia might actually be fueling the desire for transition in young people?
This is one of the most powerful arguments the GCF movement uses.
It's a central argument. They claim that kids who would naturally grow up to be gay, lesbian, or bisexual are instead being funneled onto a medical pathway to transition.
And what's the evidence cited for that?
It's pretty distressing. Clinicians at the UK's Tavistock Clinic, the Gender Identity Development Service, or GIDs, they reportedly saw this so often that the staff had a dark joke that there would be no gay people left.
A dark joke.
Yes. And one clinician reportedly felt that the whole pathway they were administering looked an awful lot like conversion therapy for gay children.
So if that claim is true, that youth are being transitioned to avoid homophobia, what do the sources suggest is driving it? Is it parental pressure, societal fear?
It's both. The sources give some really concrete and, frankly, heartbreaking examples of this social pressure.
Like what?
Well, there are accounts of parents who were explicitly happier with a transitioned, heterosexual-appearing child than a gay one.
That's very direct.
Very. One account talks about a Texan mother from a conservative background who used timeouts, spankings, and endless prayers because her child was acting girly.
And this was before transition.
Yes. She even Googled conversion therapy before finally allowing the transition, admitting her deep fear of having a gay child.
And this isn't just a Western phenomenon.
Not at all. The source points to Iran, where same-sex acts can be punished by death, but sex reassignment surgery is legally accepted.
So there's immense pressure on gay men and lesbians to transition. It's a form of social correction.
A legal and social one, yes.
So we have this paradoxical situation where both sides are accusing the other of conversion therapy. How do the sources break that down?
It's a total rhetorical battleground. You have GCF groups like Sex Matters who explicitly call gender-affirming care modern conversion therapy.
Because it erases future gay identities.
Right. They argue it should be restricted or even criminalized. But then conversely, you have LGBTQ plus groups and other critics who argue that the approach GCF groups promote.
This gender exploratory therapy.
Yes, that is itself a form of conversion therapy aimed at forcing a young person to reject a trans identity and just accept their birth sex, framing their feelings as trauma or homophobia.
Let's move into one of the most intensely charged areas reported in the sources.
Yeah.
The conflict over sexual orientation.
Specifically, lesbian identity.
Right.
This is a core conflict. GCF proponents argue that if you allow trans women to define themselves as women, it, quote, threatens a secure understanding of the concept lesbian.
Why?
Because for them, lesbianism has to be strictly defined as a same-sex orientation based only on biological sex. No exceptions.
And the sources detail a very specific social conflict that has come out of this stance.
Exactly. The material describes this phenomenon of some heterosexual men who transition and then identify themselves as lesbians.
And this group, which critics label male lesbians, what are they accused of doing?
They're accused of targeting biological lesbians, shaming them, and trying to redefine their attraction.
This is where that term, the cotton ceiling, comes from. Let's break that down because it really shows the severity of the reported conflict.
It's a very provocative term. It was coined to describe the supposed sexual discrimination that lesbians show when they reject sexual partners with penises.
The name itself refers to underwear.
Yes, literally the women's underwear they allegedly want to get past. But the critical point the sources make here is the pressure. Lesbians are being pressured to redefine their sexual orientation attraction based on sex into an attraction based on gender identity.
And the rhetoric used against lesbians who, stick to their sex-based attraction is reported to be pretty extreme.
It is. The sources report that critics have compared their rejection of partners with penises to racism.
Racism.
Yes. Or they've been accused of being socially conditioned to only want sex with women, as if their own same-sex attraction isn't real, but just a preference they need to get over.
Which is described as a huge encroachment on the ability of gay people to define their own sexuality.
I'm a massive one.
And we're seeing this conflict go beyond activist circles and forums, right? It's hitting established institutions.
Precisely. This ideological pressure is now pushing to redefine basic terms. Sources point to attempts to change dictionary definitions of words like bisexual to be about attraction to gender identity instead of sex.
And what about funding?
There's evidence of a major shift in priorities within LGBTQ+ advocacy. One analysis noted a huge jump in funding for trans causes around 2012, which eventually started outpacing funding for gay, lesbian, and bisexual issues combined.
And that's cited as evidence that some big LGBT groups are reprioritizing things.
Shifting focus from same-sex identity protection to queer and trans issues, yes.
Okay, so when we turn to the more scholarly and institutional analysis of GCF rhetoric,
Right.
what's the view there?
The view is often very harsh. Experts from a lot of different fields describe GCF as transphobic. They characterize it as a fringe movement that really only gets its prominence through a lot of media exposure.
And the rhetoric itself.
They note that it often reinforces this really offensive trope of the trans woman as a man in drag who is a danger to women.
So terms like gender critical are seen as, what, a dog whistle?
Yes, described as a dog whistle used to make anti-trans sentiment sound like a reasonable debate.
And critically, this movement isn't operating in a vacuum. What do the sources say about its political alliances?
They point very strongly to GCF forming alliances with the broader anti-gender movement.
Okay.
Critiques state that GCF groups often align with right-wing, far-right, and even anti-feminist organizations.
We have examples.
Yes, documented examples of GCF groups aligning with the evangelical right in the U.S. and with conservative think tanks in Europe. UN Women has even weighed in.
What do they say?
They described the gender-critical movement, among others, as extreme anti-rights movements that rely on hateful propaganda and disinformation to frame equality as a threat to traditional values.
Even politicians have commented on this.
Nicholas Sturgeon did, yes. She noted that forces on the far right have weaponized the trans rights debate to push their own agendas.
Okay, let's slow down here. We've been talking about philosophy and rhetoric, but now the sources shift to documented human harm. This feels vital to understanding the real-world impact.
This is maybe the most important part of the deep dive because the sources are really clear about the real suffering that stems from this conflict.
What are the tangible consequences?
Well, first, there are direct reports of physical harassment and abuse, trans people being spat on or physically challenged just for trying to use a public restroom.
And this hostility isn't always even directed at the right people, so to speak.
No. Crucially, it sometimes hits cisgender women who just happen to appear masculine.
And what about the impact on patient welfare? On policy?
The mental health toll is significant, and it's being acknowledged at an institutional level.
By who?
An NHS Sussex internal update, for one. It specifically acknowledged an increased risk of suicidal ideation and a negative impact on patient experience because of all the policy changes and investigations into gender-affirming care.
So these aren't just abstract grievances.
Not at all. The key takeaway here is that the rhetorical pressure and the policy shifts that follow are generating measurable, life-threatening impacts on the mental health of an already vulnerable group of patients.
And beyond that individual harm, the GCF rhetoric is also directly linked to these big legislative battles, right?
Yes. The material connects GCF activism directly to things like the intense years-long fight over the UK Gender Recognition Act reforms. It also shows up in legal cases about discrimination based on holding gender-critical beliefs.
So the documentation is clear.
Yeah.
This isn't just some philosophical debate.
No, it's a conflict with immediate, measurable, and very negative consequences.
So to summarize this deep dive, we've analyzed gender-critical feminism, a movement defined by its absolute focus on immutable, biological sex.
A movement stemming from decades of radical feminist thought. We've traced its really controversial claims about homophobia driving transition.
And we've examined that highly sexualized conflict over lesbian identity and the cotton ceiling.
And finally, we've reviewed how critics and institutions describe its methods and alliances as fitting within this larger anti-rights political force that uses misinformation.
And the sources just make it undeniably clear that these ideological battles, whether they're about defining womanhood or defending sex-based rights, they have immediate measurable consequences.
They impact mental health and lead to real-world harassment.
You have a movement arguing for sex-based protections that its critics say actually reinforces the very same patriarchal victimhood narrative that feminists historically wanted to dismantle.
And that brings us to this deep paradox that's reported in the sources, the whole idea of internalized oppression.
Where an oppressed group starts to adopt the negative beliefs of the oppressor.
Right. And in this context, you see some historical radical feminists using language like arguing that being female is inherently tied to violence and unavoidable oppression by men, that other feminists would describe as a form of internalized oppression itself.
So we've looked at a situation where groups that have all been historically marginalized, women, gay people, trans people, are now locked in some of the most visible and, frankly, emotionally draining conflicts of our time.
It's a tragic situation.
So in the foundational language that one group uses to fight oppression is described by another as a mechanism of internalized oppression. What has to happen politically and socially before any true common ground can even be sought? That's the complex and vital question we're left with.